So, an author named Gordon McKenzie was also, he's also a sculptor, and the local elementary school in his area discovered that he had this talent, and they asked him to come and for a couple of years in a row give demonstrations to each of the different grades about what being a sculptor was like and what you did. And he said the most interesting thing happened. He said to start every group, I would ask the kids, I would say, how many of you are artists? And he said, when I asked the kindergarten class, every hand went up. Oh yeah, I'm an artist. When he asked the second grade class, only about half the hands went up. And for several years in a row, whenever he asked the fifth grade class, only one or two hands would go up. And he said, I always found this fascinating, and I do too. Because it's not as if these kids lost the ability to put the crayon on paper, right? Like, you know, when you hit third grade and suddenly you can't do it. So something else must be going on here, right? Something else is going on. And obviously, it's probably not just one thing, but it's a whole myriad of factors. But the reality is, by the time that these kids are leaving elementary school, they no longer, the vast majority of them, thought of themselves as artists. Now, you know, partly it may be a problem of definition, because if you define an artist as somebody who paints or whatever, then that may not be something you do. But really, technically, an artist is anyone who creates art, right? I mean, that's the baseline definition. So what is happening that all of these elementary kids, for several years in a row, and I would imagine it's still probably the case, suddenly decide that they aren't artists? I would argue that probably one of the biggest things that does it, all of these different factors sort of combine to change the story that they tell about themselves. Because when you're in kindergarten, the story you tell about yourself is, man, you have to see this, because this thing I just drew, this is unbelievable. You are not, this is going to blow your mind. The story that you tell yourself as a fourth grader or fifth grader must be different, right? And you draw something, and it doesn't get any better as you get an adult, right? As you become an adult. As you create something, what's the very first thing that you think? Oh, this isn't any good. Oh my goodness. I can't even, I don't even want to talk about it. I don't even want to talk about it. How many times have you seen this in other people, you know, that someone will, whether they're singing a solo or whether they're writing something or they're doing something, and you go up to them and say, that was beautiful, that was amazing. What's their first reaction? Oh, I can't even believe I did that in public. That makes me want to vomit. Not everybody, but most people, you know, right? That they have this sense and this story that what they create, that this stuff that comes, that this beautiful art that they make, it's not any good. It has lost value. It's basically worthless. When it's not true, right? As someone who is sitting out and hears the beautiful music that they are making, you can say, and then not even people you're related to, not even people you have to like what they do, but people that you know you are not connected to, and you go, that's beautiful, that's wonderful, what a gift that is. And yet they can't see it. That person just is, you know, incapable of seeing it. What's going on? I would argue that it is as much the story we tell ourselves as anything. It is as much the story that we tell ourselves as we are going through our day. Because even if we aren't aware of it, even if we wouldn't frame it like that, there is always a story going on in our head. There is always a story as we are trying to interpret and make sense about what the world around us looks like and how we interact and relate to that world. And a lot of times, just because of human nature, what we hold on to are the mistakes that we've made and the hard words that other people have said to us, not the compliments or the good things that happen, right? Somebody could shower you with compliments, and you say, thank you, and they say, but you know what, this part right here was a little bit off. What's the one thing you're going to remember out of every bit of that, right? We tell ourselves these stories and they grow bigger and bigger till that's all that we have the space and the room for in our heads. So much so that when we get up and actually do something and somebody says, "That was beautiful, that was amazing, that was wonderful," there is no space in our world for that sort of reality. We have so much of that negative talk and so much of that negative, it has filled up so much of the space in our world and in our heads and in our story that when they say, "No, you are really gifted at this," there's no place for it to go. It just bounces off of us and sort of floats away. This is, I don't think, a new problem, and I don't think that this is something that is just, characteristic just of Americans or just of us or just of what we do. I think this is part of how we are wired and part of the struggle and the brokenness of who we are. And I think that we can even see it back in Scripture. This morning we're continuing our story of Moses. Now last week we talked about the miraculous way that Moses was brought into, Moses was born into a world where all Hebrew males were supposed to be killed. And yet, Moses was saved by the midwife, saved by his mom, saved by his sister, and even saved by Pharaoh's daughter. We talked about how God is constantly creating and redeeming. God showed it in Moses' life, and God is constantly creating and redeeming in our lives as well. So here's what's happened from last week to where we're going to pick up this week. You read the first part of Exodus 2 that we read last week, and the very next verse you read says, Moses grew up. Okay, so Moses grew up, but Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. Now this is interesting because Moses is growing up as one of the favored ones, right? Pharaoh's household is the place where you want to be, the opulence, the riches, the glory, the ease. Because all of the other Hebrew people are not experiencing the same type of upbringing that Moses did. These Hebrew people are suffering under slavery and struggling and finding life incredibly difficult and overwhelming. So what we see is that as Moses grows up, he sees that an Egyptian is abusing, is beating a Hebrew. He looks around, he doesn't see anybody else around, and so he kills the Egyptian. Gets rid of the body. Feels like he's done something good. Feels like he has stood up. Because even though he has grown up in the Egyptian world over here, of privilege and pride, he's still Hebrew, and he understands that. So look, he has stood up for his people. He is truly a Hebrew. The next verse says, the next day, there were two Hebrews fighting with each other. Moses comes up and goes, guys, come on. We shouldn't be doing this. And one of them says, are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian? Almost, and I would paraphrase it as, you can get away with whatever you want. So are you going to get rid of us like you got rid of that Egyptian? And Moses is stunned. See, because what these Hebrews are saying is don't think that you're like us, because you're not really like us. You grew up over here. You grew up in privilege and pride. You're as much Egyptian as you are Hebrew. Moses can't take it. The word gets back to Pharaoh that Moses has killed an Egyptian, and Pharaoh wants to kill Moses. So Moses flees. He heads out into the desert, and literally it's sort of like a bad romantic comedy. He sits down at this well, completely out of options. And all of these sheep come up. And Moses meets the shepherd and marries the daughter and becomes the shepherd out in the middle of the wilderness. And that's Moses' life. And that's what he's doing. He is as far away as he could be from the world of Egypt, out here in the middle of nowhere, tending some sheep. And that's where we find our story picks up in Exodus chapter 3. Either you're invited to turn in your Bible, or if you'd like to use the Pew Bible in the seat beneath you, it is on page 56, Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses! And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Verse 9. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. All right. So far, God's just shown up and said to Moses, look, I know back in Egypt everything's bad. I've seen this. I've heard it. It breaks my heart. And Moses can go, yep, until this verse right here, right? This is where Moses gets off the bus. Because God says, so now, I've decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to save them from slavery. I'm going to not only take them out of that, but I'm going to put them in a place where they will have abundance, more than they could possibly imagine or hope for. And I'm going to have you do it, Moses. You're going to be the one who goes and gives this message. Verse 11, Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Okay, so a couple of problems here, and we'll get to the second problem in a minute. It's arguably a bigger problem. Problem number one is the last time Moses was hanging out with these Israelites, they weren't super excited to be with him. So first thing Moses has to do is go convince all these Israelites, hey, we need to go tell the most powerful man in the world that he needs to let his unpaid labor force go. Right? Okay, that should work out well for us, right? Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? Now, a name in the Bible is more than just, hey, I'm Bill. A name in the Bible means who you are and what you do. It is your identity. So, what Moses is asking is not only, which God am I going to tell them is doing it, but what sort of God are you that will create this kind of situation to happen? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Okay, so we need to pause here for a second. Because I am who I am, if you are to translate this out of the Hebrew, it is sort of the most basic sort of being verb form. And so you have most people translate it, I am who I am. The sense of God has been and will be the same forever and ever and ever in a present tense kind of way. But literally, if you're in Hebrew 101 and you are translating this, this is technically future tense. Which is why the little note at the bottom of your Bible says, or I will be who I will be. I will be who I will be. God is God here in the present tense. I am who I am. God is also the God of the future in that I will be. If you want to know who I am, watch and see what I'm about to do. Then you'll know the kind of God that I am. So God is the God of the present. God is the God of the future. And then, God is also the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is the God of the past as well. The God who has seen and brought their ancestors through the past, who is present with them in their suffering now and will lead them out of this type of slavery. This is the God who is going to be the one to lead them. The one, by the way, who is causing this bush to catch on fire and not burn up. This is the God who will lead them. So skip ahead, if you were with me, to verse 21. God continues talking and says, I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, toward you, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her daughter and her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. So not only am I going to deliver you out of the most powerful nation from the most powerful man in the world, they are going to give you their stuff to get you out of here. We are used to this. We're used to this kind of story. We understand what's coming. We know the beats of this, at least many of us do, so we can miss the marvel and the wonder of this. But this is a truly audacious and ridiculous story, right? When you hear it for the very first time, if you can imagine what that's like, God says, not only are you, Moses, going to lead all of these people out, not only is that going to happen, but they're going to pay you to go. They're going to give you their stuff to go. And Moses reacts like, if we are honest, all of us would react. If you look at chapter 4, Moses answered, what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? And so throughout chapter 4, we're not reading them all, but throughout chapter 4, God presents signs and says, well, do this. And then Moses says, well, what if this happens? Okay, we'll do this. Well, you know what? I'm not very good at speaking, God. Are you sure that I'm the one that you want? And God goes, you have to read between lines. What is it? And so you have this sense where Moses cannot wrap his brain around what God is saying. God is literally speaking to Moses, has caused this bush to not burn up, but is telling him this unbelievably crazy story. And Moses goes, can't you just pick somebody else? Wouldn't it be so much easier if you just let somebody else do it? And God basically says, no, this is what I've created you. Moses' story in his head is that he is broken and messed up, and all he is good for is keeping these sheep fed and alive out here in the middle of nowhere. And God says, no, I want you to do this. And there is no room in Moses' head for that sort of reality. There's no room in Moses' head for that sort of possibility that God could use Moses in that kind of way. And when I think about that, I can't help but think about my own life and so many of us that I know, that we have all of the space in our world filled with all of that kind of negative talk, with all that kind of struggles, with all of the problems, with all of the mistakes from our past. So much so that when God shows up, in whatever way God shows up to you and says, I really think you need to do this, you go, not me. There's no way I can be. What are you talking about? Me? No way, God. You don't know what kind of mistakes I've made, even though God does. You don't know how screwed up I am, even though God does. You don't know how broken and how selfish and all the ways in which I've turned stuff sideways that probably will never be put right again. Don't you want to get somebody else? And God says, no. This is who I've created. This is what I've created for you to do. This is who you are. But our heads are so filled with this story that tells us that we are not, that we have no chance to hear when God says, yes, you are. We have no place at all to hear. What would it look like in our lives and in our world? What would it look like if we let some of that go? What would it look like if we believed what God said, that it's not because of some sort of special gift you have, it's not because of some sort of special talent, It is because this is what I have created you for. Even if we can't figure out how to let go of this huge story that fills so much of our space, what if we could just for half a second believe God? What would it look like if we said, God, I have no idea how this would work, but I trust you? What could change? What could move? What could open up in your heart and in your life and in your world? This is not working. All right, Mike, will you just advance it? There you go. Okay, thank you, Mike. This is a guy named Bob Edling. Okay, Bob worked in rocket science. He did all sorts of work in rocket science and became one of the foremost engineers of the booster rockets that sent the spaceships up. Okay, this is what Bob did, and was one of the leading engineers as part of the subcontracted company that handled all of that for NASA. Okay, in the mid-80s, they were working to get a launch ready, and Bob realized that there was going to be a problem. Bob realized that the morning of the launch was going to be too cold, and so the reality is this could put the shuttle in danger. And so 2 weeks before, or a week before, he sent all of this, he called the 3 different people he knew to call, and he said, here's what we need to do. We need to get a meeting about this. We need to make sure that this doesn't happen, because something horrible can happen. So he gathered all the material he possibly could, went to his boss. His boss agreed. They went to NASA and said, we can't do this. We can't do this today. There's no way we'll be able to make this happen. It's too dangerous. And NASA said, what do you want us to do? There's all sorts of pressure from all sorts of places. The State of the Union was that night. There's all sorts of pressure from all sorts of places to make this happen right now. It'll be fun. So the day of, Bob was devastated. He was calling, again, as many people as he possibly could, and he said, this is going to be a disaster. And as the launch got ready to go, he held his wife and wept. 73 seconds after launch, the Challenger exploded, because the O-ring that he knew would fail failed. That was in 1986. 30 years ago. January, and 30 years ago, after it happened, National Public Radio sent a reporter and found Bob. Bob served as an anonymous source on one of the first reports that broke the true news about what happened at the Challenger explosion. As the 30-year anniversary is coming up, it was coming up this year, that same reporter called Bob again and said, Bob, how do you reflect on this? And Bob started crying. He said that soon after the Challenger explosion, he had to retire because he couldn't work anymore. He was so racked with guilt that he did not do enough, that he should have been the one that had tried something else to get people to hear that they had to stop doing this. The reporter said, what more could you have done? You called as many people as you could. You did all of these different things. What more could you have done? And all Bob could do was weep. And one of the things that Bob said was, and he quoted in this article from January, I think that this was one of the mistakes that God made. He shouldn't have picked me for that job. Next time I talk to God, I'm going to have to ask him, why me? You picked the loser. This is an 89-year-old man who for 30 years has been haunted by this. This story goes out on NPR in January. Within 3 days, hundreds of people have contacted him. Hundreds of people have contacted him and said, what? Bob, this isn't your fault. You did all that you knew to do. And yet the story in Bob's head was so big and so full. Bob at 89 wasn't able to read, so his daughter would read each of these letters, each of these emails to him. And he'd shake his head and go, no, you don't understand, it's my fault. People who listened weren't the only ones that responded, though. Two of his bosses, in fact, two of the people who initially agreed with him and then gave the go-ahead for the launch were some of the people who wrote him and said, Bob, it's not your fault. We messed up. We're the ones to blame. You did all you knew how to do. But the one that really made a difference was when NASA made a quote. And NASA's quote said, the deaths of the 7 Challenger astronauts serve to remind us to remain vigilant and to listen to those like Bob Ebling who have the courage to speak up in the first place. When Bob heard that NASA had said, no, you did what you were supposed to do, some of the cracks started to form in that story. Within the next month, he was able to let go of a lot of the guilt, his daughter said. He was able to finally find some peace for the first time in 30 years, able to sleep well at night. And 3 weeks later, Bob passed away. 89 years old, and he spent a third of his life racked in guilt because his story told him that it's his fault and he did not do enough. In the meantime, after he retired, he restored and became an environmentalist around his area, restoring all of the one of the natural preserves around his area, so much so that George W. Bush gave him an honorary award for conservation for all of the work that he did during that time. And yet, when the reporter talked to him later, he said, God picked a loser. The most powerful one, I think, of all the letters that came into Bob wasn't NASA and it wasn't his bosses. It was a guy named Bob Sider who lived in North Carolina, who was an engineer himself, who wrote, and he said, Bob, you did all you knew how to do. You did everything that you knew. And then he said, Bob, I'm a religious man. And I believe with all my heart that God did not pick a loser. God picked Bob Ebling. Whatever sort of story you tell yourself, whatever sort of story that fills your head that says, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I'm too broken, I'm a loser. Hear the good news. It's not because of your gifts or your abilities that God wants to use you. In fact, God uses us in the midst of our brokenness to transform the world. All you have to do is to be open. All you have to do is to create the space so that when God calls, you can respond. God didn't pick a loser. God picked you. Would you pray?